Conflict is at our door. Russia has brought war back to Europe.
The NATO Secretary General is preparing for a war with us. How can you prepare NATO for a war with Russia if the main member of NATO doesn't consider us as an enemy?
Russian President Vladimir Putin firing back after NATO Secretary General Rutte warned the Kremlin may attack other countries in Europe. This as the European Union agrees to lend Ukraine $105 billion. For more, let's bring in the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb. Mr. President, thank you so much for joining the Sunday briefing, sir.
Always a pleasure.
So you were in Berlin for the meeting with President Zelensky last weekend and also the U.S. delegation. This weekend, the Russians are in Miami again. We are seeing the pace of these talks seem to ramp up, but at least publicly, we haven't seen any signs that Russia is making any new concessions. What can you tell us about how close we are to reaching some kind of an agreement?
Well, we're probably closer than we have been at any time of this war. And I'd say that in the past 3 to 4 weeks, the two special envoys of President Trump, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, have been working around the clock to bring the two parties closer. And in Berlin, we had two key takeaways. One was that Europe, Ukraine, and the United States were united in our resolve to get a just and lasting peace and working together. And the second one was the idea of security guarantees for Ukraine. So we're sort of almost there, but, you know, the most difficult 5% are still left.
Hearing President Putin in his year-end address, it sure sounds like Russia is unwilling to accept anything less than 100% of what it's demanding. Listen to Putin here.
The goals of the special military operation will be achieved unconditionally. If Ukraine doesn't want to have a substantive discussion, then Russia will liberate its historical lands on the battlefield.
Finland, as you well know, gave up 10% of its territory to Russia to maintain its independence after the Winter War and War of Continuation. In your mind, as this is being negotiated, is there anything that Ukraine must not give up?
Well, I think the three principles of statehood are key here. One is independence, the second one is sovereignty to decide, and the third one is territorial integrity. And I think Finland lost sovereignty and territorial integrity in World War II, but we retained our independence. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that Ukraine not only maintains its independence and sovereignty, but also as much of its territory as possible. So what we try to do with the Ukrainians is to work at different types of solutions. And what you saw President Putin do there is quite typical in diplomacy. So you kind of drive one language and rhetoric in public, but then perhaps your negotiators are a little bit more flexible. But I don't think that Russia has changed its main aim, which is basically to destroy the existence of Ukraine, and that is what we're trying to avoid happening.
Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence here in the U.S., said something interesting overnight. She posted this: deep state warmongers and their propaganda media are again trying to undermine President Trump's efforts to bring peace to Ukraine and indeed Europe by falsely claiming that the U.S. intelligence community agrees to and supports EU-NATO viewpoint that Russia's aim is to invade or conquer Europe in order to gin up support for their pro-war policies. The truth is that U.S. intelligence assesses that Russia does not even have the capability to conquer and occupy Ukraine, what to speak of invading and occupying Europe. I mean, contrast that with what we heard from the NATO Secretary General sounding the alarm that Europe should be preparing potentially for the scale of war that our grandparents saw. Who is correct here on what Russia is planning on doing?
I think they're both speaking to different audiences, and we work a lot with U.S. intelligence, and we know pretty much what is going on. And I agree with Tulsi Gabbard's assessment that the NATO resolve is so high that there's no interest for Russia to attack. And take Finland as an example. We have one of the largest armies in Europe, and we have an 830-mile border with Russia. We have obligatory military service. We have over 60 F-18s, just bought 64 F-35s. We have the biggest artillery in Europe, and we have long-range missiles, air, land, and sea. And as I always say, we don't have them because we're worried about Stockholm or Sweden. We have them because we want to have a deterrent against Russia. Now, what Secretary General Mark Rutte is doing, he wants to hike up support for an increase in defense expenditure of NATO member states. In other words, countries who don't have the size of a military that we do here in Finland. And I think Secretary General is right about it as well. So I think both Tulsi Gabbard and Secretary General Mark Rutte are right.
It seems like he has been warning that Russia's economy is on a wartime footing and that Europe needs to get with the program, basically, or they could be caught on their back heel. Have you spoken with President Trump lately about the war and about where Europe is in its ability to defend against Russian aggression?
Well, we spoke about the war a few weeks back, but lately we've been really engaged in the engine room together with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And of course, our message is quite clear. The Russian economy is actually not doing that well. They have zero growth, they are out of reserves, they have high interest rates and high inflation, and it's not improving. And I think one of the things that hit the Russian economy quite hard were the American sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. And secondly, Russia is not doing well on the battlefield either. Remember that in the past 1,000 days, they have advanced less than 1 percentage point of Ukrainian territory. So they're not getting through their strategic military aims either. And these are the types of messages that we keep on relating among allies, including, of course, the United States. At the same time, I do think that President Trump and his team are doing an excellent job in mediating peace. It's an uphill battle, but we're almost there.
And very quickly, because we're almost out of time, your mention of the sanctions and the huge impact that they had. Do you think that the U.S. should do more in the way of sanctions right now, or is there a concern that that could upend the peace negotiations?
Well, I think the balance of carrot and stick in the negotiations is working. And right now, we're working towards peace negotiations. Europe took a decision on the frozen assets that you mentioned earlier. And I think what needs to happen is that if we get a deal between Europe, the United States and Ukraine, and then Russia rejects that deal, that's when it's time to hike up the sanctions, because they work.
President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, thank you very much, Mr. President, for coming on the Sunday briefing this morning. Always appreciate your time.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.